Let's pray. Let's pray. Father, thank you again for this day. We thank you for your being present with us in it. We thank you that you're not a God of our own manufacture. You're not a God that we have to hunt for, but you've revealed yourself, and you've done it in no uncertain terms very clearly. That we come to you on the grounds that you have set, and yet, Father, it is a gracious, supernatural life that you grant to us to live. We thank you for the extremely important part that your word plays in this, and pray that you would help us to take it seriously, help us to continue to put it together, and to be able to just capture its essence in the way that you want us to, that would lead us to Christ, who is our life. And I ask this in His name. On page 45, we basically looked at the first 18 chapters of Exodus. And this is really a prelude to what the main thrust of Exodus becomes, and that is the establishment of the nation. And the last part of the book is the constitution of the Son Nation. The first thing we see is the redemption of the Lord's Son, of Yahweh's Son, which is what the Exodus is. It's not just a transplant. It's not a transfer job. It's not simply moving from one place to another. It's actually the securing of the release of a people who have been improperly taken into bondage. And they are God's Son, and therefore God is the Goel, God is the kinsman redeemer, and this is the word that's used, which will be introduced or explored in the law, and the specific duties of the kinsman redeemer will be traced out in the book of Leviticus. We see that God is acting as the kinsman. His Son is in bondage. And so this is the clear verbal expression, and it is also the image and everything that's going on there. We see that in the wilderness, there is a time where God has to care for His Son in the wilderness, like a parent has to care for a newborn infant. And just the basic needs of life. And so we find Him supplying water, food, protection, and so forth. And then we come to chapter 19, which is really a pivotal chapter in the book. And this is the commissioning of Yahweh's Son as the priest nation. And the rest of the book of Exodus is really about that. They have been born, in a sense, they've been created apart from anything they did. They were supernaturally created by God giving Abraham and Sarah a baby that they could not have had physically, they could not have had on their own. And from that beginning, the nation has grown, the people have grown. And so they had nothing to do with that. But now they are going to enter into a mutual agreement where they will receive God's commission to them. They will receive the mandate to be a certain kind of a people, to be a certain kind of a nation. And that very much, in fact, there is a lot of verbal allusion to this. That very much is like a child coming into adulthood, a firstborn son coming into adulthood in a family in the ancient East, and then taking over the responsibility to work the inheritance of the land, the double portion of inheritance that a firstborn received generally, and to act responsibly with respect to that inheritance. And God is taking them into their inheritance. The land of Canaan is called their inheritance, their heritage, over and over and over again. And so we very much have this birth, growth, adulthood, responsible adult living image throughout all of the development of the nation of Israel. And this passage beginning in Exodus 19, really run through the rest of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, has to do with that coming of age. It's now Israel is expected to start doing things. They are to the point where the relationship was going to be a two-way street, and there are going to be certain things expected of them. And so they are entering into their adulthood. So this is what is going to happen in the rest of the book of Exodus. Now, in 1 to 25, this is what we find. And these are two verses that are really key verses with respect to understanding what the nation of Israel is, why they have been created. God has brought them into being, as I said, supernaturally. And he says, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." And we're going to see a different kind of a covenant made here than the covenant that was made in the Exodus. And so we see here that they are entering into a new phase. Now, where does this take place? Do you remember what the historical, geographical, locational context is in Exodus chapter 19? You can get your Bible out if you want. It's at Mount Sinai. And what's going on at Mount Sinai? Is it an amusement park? Is it an oasis? It's a mountain, all right? We have mountains around here, huh? What? Okay, he shows himself to Israel, and what are some of the circumstances of that revelation? Lightning, what's that? Can't touch it. What happens if they touch it? They're going to die. All right? So this is, why would he bring them to this? And so he tells them why they're there, and then, he warns Moses about the people coming near. God's going to talk to Moses, but the people have to maintain their distance. They have to be sanctified. And over again in this passage, the word mountain occurs, and it occurs in the most strong context. It's a terrifying thing. Here it is, God on the mountain. God has brought the people to the mountain, but the mountain also is like a danger. It's like a barrier. And throughout the book of Exodus as well, you've got Moses. And Moses is in this unique relationship with God whereby he is bringing the people to the land. He's bringing the people to the place of adulthood, to the place of service to the Lord. And Moses is a critical person. Were it not for Moses, the people would have died in the wilderness. And so mountains are dangerous places. When you come to mountains, you come to something that is both positive and negative. And that's what the nation of Israel was coming to as well. Because the mountain, and we'll pick up this theme later, we'll see how the mountain represents two really completely, seemingly opposite things. The mountain in Exodus chapter 19 is designed, first of all, in the whole manifestation, to keep the people away. And yet it is also designed to bring the people into the presence of God. And so this is a quite interesting mountain, isn't it? Bring the people near me. Sanctify them. I'm going to meet with them, but don't let them come too close. Don't let them touch the mountain. Don't let them come up with you, because this is serious business. And so we find Exodus chapter 19 introducing this whole scene where God is going to bring the people into His presence, but He's bringing them in a certain way. And Moses becomes critical to how the people come into His presence, and that's why we would call Moses a mediator. Now, what's going on in Exodus is that God is going to make a covenant with the people, a treaty. And He is going to use an ancient treaty formula, a method of that kings had used to relate to their people and to the subject nations that they would conquer and to subject kings that would be over nations that they would conquer for hundreds or 1,000 years. And I asked you last Friday, if God were to make a nation today His own nation, how would He do it so that people would know that God was the king? And you came up with some interesting suggestions. But quite frankly, I'm not sure He could today, because we do not have today what existed at this time in Israel's history, back in the middle of the second millennium BC. We don't have a standard, conventional way that rulers related to their peoples, to their subject peoples, even to their own nations. We've got all these different kinds of nations and all these models on earth, and there just really isn't a shared understanding, a shared convention. But that wasn't the case then. And by God's design, for hundreds of years, perhaps 1,000 years or more, kings had been using political treaties to relate to their peoples, and these are very definite. And we have unearthed a number of these. You have some in your book, and I meant to bring that book today. I brought it Friday and didn't bring it today. But these ancient political treaties had certain parts. They had a preamble that identified the king. And you will read, this is a section when you get to Deuteronomy and encountering the Old Testament. You don't need to write this down. But this is the excerpt from a preamble of one of these kinds of ancient treaties. It says, "These are the words of Mursilis, the great king, king of the Hittites, the valiant." Remember, the Hittites were people in the land that were going to be replaced, supplanted when God brought the Israelites in, and we find that in the list. And so for hundreds of years, the Hittite kings had been making political treaties with conquered nations. And then there was a historical prologue, and the historical prologue talked about the king and all that the king had done for the other king or the subject people or country. When your father died, in this case, it is a treaty that is renewed, made with one king who has taken over the kingdom from his father. And his father was subject to Mursilis. They were a vassal kingdom, a vassal people. And so he is looking back at the history of himself. "When your father died, I did not drop you. Since your father mentioned your name to me with great praise, I sought after you. To be sure, you were sick and ailing, but I still let you replace your father and accepted your brothers and sisters and your land in oath for you." So what he's saying is, I am such a great guy, I am such a wonderful king, that I'm going to extend to you the same kind of arrangement, the same treaty that I had with your father. Now, it's a treaty in which, the young, sickly, ailing king was going to have to pay tribute and be under the submission of the other king. But nonetheless, this is how the historical prologue worked in these ancient treaties. You would also have stipulations. And this would be the part where the king would say what he was responsible for and what the subject king or kingdom or people were responsible for. And so we have the example, "You shall remain loyal to me, the Hittite king, the Hittite land, and my sons and grandsons forever. The tribute imposed upon your grandfather and your father, 300 shekels of high-quality gold, you will also present to me. Do not turn your eyes to anyone else. Your fathers presented tribute to Egypt, but you shall never do this." So here's the situation. The Hittite king, the Hittites were up from North Anatolia, which is now Turkey. And of course, you've got all these little kingdoms, and then you've got these other nations who are also always vying for allegiance and making treaties so that they could be protected and they could, take over the world. And so basically he's saying, do not even think about shifting your loyalty to Egypt. If you do, you're going to get it. But the stipulations basically are, here's what you need to do, and it all had to do with you be loyal to me. You'll pay me tribute, you'll put my statue in your land. When my ambassador comes down, you'll, treat him right, and if I ask you to do something, you need to respond. If we go to the war and I ask you for people to go with me, you better send some. and so forth. So those were the kinds of things that were stipulations, and it all centered around loyalty. Now, what if they failed to keep those stipulations? There's the provisions for deposit in the temple and public reading. So they would draw up this document and put it in a place where it could be referred to, and kind of a symbolic, it's like the contract. A duplicate of this document has been deposited before the god Tesub. At regular intervals they shall read in the presence of the king and in the presence of the sons of the country this document, and so forth. And so we see here that there's a formality to this. There's a document associated with it. And then there is a list of witnesses. And so in these ancient treaties they would call the gods to witness. The sun god of heaven, the sun goddess of Arina, Ishtar, the gods and goddesses, the Hittites, Ishtar, the gods and goddesses, the Amorites, all the gods, and so forth. They're called to witness. And basically, it's a threat. If you disobey this, my gods are going to get you. Okay? And but that's what the witness was, and they took it pretty seriously. And then there was a cursings and a blessings formula. It says what happens if the parties fail. If I fail to honor this treaty, may these gods of the oath destroy Dupi Tesub together with his wife, his son, his grandson. Now this is an example from another treaty using a different king's name. This example in your book has put together a couple of different treaty documents, but because we don't have, in some cases, we're missing parts of treaties. So these gods will destroy Dupi Tesub together with his wife, his son, his grandson, his house, his land, and everything that he owns. But if Dupi Tesub honors the treaty inscribed on this tablet, may these gods protect him together with his wife, his son, his grandson, his house, and his country. And so we see here that there is a conditional aspect, and there are blessings and cursings that are invoked with regard to keeping or breaking the covenant. Now, when we get to Deuteronomy, we're going to find this covenant treaty formula developed in a more consistent and a whole scale. But we do see the beginnings of it. We do see the basic parts of it in Exodus. And that's why I'm introducing it at this point. And so what we find in the ancient Near East is that there was this very well-known, very accepted way of kings relating to their vassal peoples, their vassal nations, those who are under their rule. And so what God is doing is He is taking the recognized, respected, extensively utilized method by which kings related to their people, and He is relating Himself to the nation of Israel. And that's what we find here. Now, can He do that? Isn't this the Bible? Isn't this beyond history and culture and so forth? Yes. But God works through history. He works through culture. He's the one who brought nations into existence. And He does it in ways so that we can relate to Him. He can relate to us. And He can declare Himself in various ways to peoples. And that's what we find here. Now, as we begin to look at Exodus chapter 20, Exodus 19 is really the prelude to this. Exodus 19 is really setting up this awesomeness of God and who He is. We come to the treaty itself as we would find it just sketched out in a very brief form in Exodus. We're going to find it developed in an extensive way in Deuteronomy. But you've got it there in your notes. Let me just run through this. The great king identifies himself. We will find that in Exodus chapter 20. The king recounts his gracious actions. The king gives the general requirements for a grateful response, and that's what the Ten Commandments are. In these political treaties, you found a general stipulation, that is a general requirement section, and you found then specifics. You found the details as to how these would look as they're worked out in life. And so the Ten Commandments will correspond to the general stipulations. We find the people's response in chapter 20, and then specific stipulations of obedience. And these are in Exodus 20 to 23. And then the king and the people ratify the covenant in chapter 24. Now, just to show how this works in Exodus itself. Remember the vassal treaties. First of all, the king would identify himself. And we find in Exodus chapter 20, verse 2, I am Yahweh your God. Now, in political treaties, this would tend to be a little longer. Why doesn't it need to be any longer in this particular context? Yeah. What's that? Why? How did they know who he was? You're right. Okay, they've just come out of the Exodus. Moses has revealed the name, Yahweh, to them. Moses has said, this is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so all of that is like the introduction to this statement. So while this seems very, very clipped, very short, yet there is a tremendous amount of content in it. That's the purpose of the book of Genesis, is to inform them as to who it was that was this Yahweh. So I am the Lord your God. And then the king's gracious actions, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Now again, this would be an expanded section in many political treaties. And the king would go on and on and on about what he had done. But what have we just had in the first 18 chapters of Exodus? Well, we have had an extensive rehearsal of what it is that God had done. So he had brought them out of Egypt. He had brought them out of the house of bondage. And so this refers back, footnote C, chapters 1 to 18. See what just goes before in this document, roll, whatever. And so we see this paralleling. And then the king's general requirements. And in the what we know as the Ten Commandments in verses 3 through 17, basically you can see what is going on here. And we'll look at these in a little bit more detail. You'll have no other gods before me. You will not make for yourself a carved image. You will not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day. Honor your father, your mother. Don't murder. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't bear false witness. Don't covet. These are the general requirements. They're the kind of statement that is called an apodictic law. It's just, you shall not do this. The rest of the laws in Exodus, and then the majority of what we find in Deuteronomy, are called casuistic or case laws. If this happens, then this is what you do. If this happens, this is what you do. If this happens, then this is what you do. And those are the kinds of law that we have in our Constitution. There's the Bill of Rights. There's just the general stipulations of what our country is based upon. And then you have specifics. You have a whole lot of rulings that judges have made. And these become the specific applicational guidelines as to how those general rules set down, those general laws and principles in the Articles of Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and so forth are to be worked out. And this is what we find in Exodus as well and in Deuteronomy. We go on and we see the king's specific stipulations then beginning in chapter 20 and verse 22. He says, Then the Lord said, Thus you shall say to the children, You have seen what I have taken you from heaven. You shall not make any gods with me, and so forth. And then he says, if you make an altar, 22 to 26 is the law of the altar, and then 21. Now these are the judgments which you will set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, and he shall serve 6 years, and the seventh you shall go free and pay nothing. If he comes in by himself, then this will happen. And if this happens, then this has happened. And if this is the case, then this is how you'll treat this. And so right away, he gives them some examples of how he is going to give them specific guidelines as to how to carry out the general instructions contained in the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are extremely general. They reveal things about God. They reveal things about His priorities. They come out of His character. But they're just very, very general. What does it mean, you shall not steal? What does it mean, you shall not covet? How does that look? And what are the penalties and so forth? The Ten Commandments don't deal with that. But what you find in this short section in Exodus, chapters 20 to 23, and what you find in Deuteronomy, in chapters, really like 12 through, 30 something, is 25, 26. You find very specific things in touching all of these areas. And so again, we see this fitting in with the form of ancient Near Eastern covenant treaties. And then there's the covenant ratification in chapter 24. All the words which the Lord has said, we will do. This is what we find in Exodus. We will find some blessing and cursing section in Leviticus. And of course, Leviticus becomes part of what happened at the mountain. Because Leviticus happens before they leave Sinai, doesn't it? It does. We'll get to Leviticus. So you will find some of the other elements, but this is the basis. And so the people would have been expected to see what this was and to see what was going on. Now, when you think about the law, you think about it from a New Testament perspective. You think about it from the standpoint of some of the statements made by Christ, some of the statements made by Paul with regard to how this was the law and grace has come, and really we tend to view the whole of the law with a negative perspective, from a negative perspective. There was nothing good about it. It just showed sin. It was impossible. It brought judgment. And that is part of what law does. But law, as given to the nation of Israel, had positive purposes. The fact that they didn't keep it, the fact that it became so broken and violated that it was impossible to keep, and the fact that God uses that as the background to the coming of Christ and the fulfilling of the law, does not negate the fact that the law in itself was a good thing given to Israel for good purposes. And I want to review with you what you read in Bayless, Creation to the Cross. I think you've read this by now, haven't you? Have you read this section? Yeah, I did. Yeah, last Friday you read all this. So what was the law? Well, it was a gracious gift of Yahweh, a constitution for the nation, a covenant with Yahweh. It was a guarantee of His presence. It was opportunity to be a blessing, and it was instruction for Israel's growth and service. I know. I'm coming back. I love to do that. Wait. I can't write that fast. I know. There's the first one. It was a gracious gift of Father Yahweh. It was a gracious gift of a father to a son. Because that's the image in the first 18 chapters of Exodus, isn't it? This is God acting as a kinsman to redeem his relative from Egyptian bondage. This is a father who is carrying his infant in the wilderness, providing water and food and protection and the beginning direction of what is life. And now the Father God has brought His Son to this mountain and is giving him the law in order for him to function. In Proverbs 4, we see this: "Hear, my children, the instruction of a father, and give attention to know understanding, for I give you good doctrine. Do not forsake my law." And it's the same word Torah that's used in Proverbs. That is simply an image statement. Just as in Proverbs we find parents having the responsibility of instruction, Torah, to their children, so we find God the Father of Israel, Yahweh, being gracious in instructing His people in what it is that they need to know as to how to live as His Son. So we need to understand that. This was a gracious provision. This wasn't something designed to just frustrate them. It wasn't something designed to just show them their sinfulness. They already knew that. That's why sacrifice had been around. They knew that. It objectifies some things, but it was a gracious gift of a father. Secondly, it was a constitution for a nation. We have noted this before, and this is how they would know what it would be that their actions and their life and what they would produce would be seen in a positive sense and related to the God who'd created them. In Deuteronomy 4:8, we're going to find this: "What great nation is there that has such statutes and righteous judgments as are in all this law which I set before you this day?" The law of Israel was far and above in character of any of the ancient law codes. And we do have law codes, the law code of Hammurabi and so forth, and I'll relate some of that in a moment. But, God was giving them something that no other nation had. And in fact, when peoples are looking for a basis for law, they go to the Bible. They don't go to Hammurabi. And that's why this has become such an important basis for law in the Western world. Here's another verse from Psalm 147. "He declares His word to Jacob, His statutes and His judgments to Israel. He has not dealt thus with any nation, and as for His judgments, they have not known them," the other nations, that is. And so, while God is responsible for the creation of all the nations, and God has placed within people a certain innate understanding of the way peoples ought to relate, and there is that accountability. And we see a lot of similarities between the kinds of social customs and the kinds of legal precedents that are necessary for a society to run. Yet it isn't even close to what God gave to the nation of Israel, as we find laid out in these both general and specific stipulations. Now, it is true that the law was given to Israel in its statutes and its specific stipulations for a limited time and place in the context. And that aspect of the law has passed away. But the general stipulations, the Ten Commandments, and them being a reflection of God and His character, are timeless and eternal. They do not pass away. And so, as a constitution, as that which binds them together as a nation and shows them how it is that they will carry on their function as a nation among the nations. Law, the Torah that we find, is far and above anything that we find in any other people. Thirdly, the law was a covenant. It was, in its totality, in the whole of it, a covenant document. And we will see that in Deuteronomy, it's more than just a covenant document. It also includes exhortation, and it is structured in a way that is not completely like a covenant document. But at the heart of it, that's what it is. And it is there unmistakably, it is there clear enough that the peoples around would understand that. They would see that. They would perceive that. So He declared to you His covenant, which He commanded you to perform, the Ten Commandments. Isn't it interesting how He takes this general stipulation part of the ancient suzerain vassal treaty, and He calls it a covenant. And so that's also what it was. And it was a guarantee of the Lord's presence. In Exodus 33, after the golden calf, and when God is provoking Moses in regard to the nation and the continuance of the nation and the presence, His presence, He says this: "For how then will it be known that your people and I have found grace in your sight?" Moses is speaking. "Except you go with us. So we shall be separate, your people and I, from all the people who are upon the face of the earth." And the law was revealed how it was that God could be in their presence. How it was that they could be at the mountain without being consumed. And that's the whole issue, is the presence of God upon earth among a people. And so what we find in the law, and that's why it has to do with the tabernacle and the priesthood and the sacrificial system, it is the key as to how they could know God's presence with them in their experience as a nation among nations. And without this extensive deliverance of the expectations, both generally and specifically, the people would not have known God's presence. Now we're going to see that there becomes a problem because they don't recognize, they don't always follow what God sets down here. But I think Bayless has done well here in putting this together, and so I'm incorporating these back into your notes.